Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to How's This, an occasional program in which we explore how we house ourselves right here in Newton, Massachusetts. And we look at how some people would like us to be housed here in the future. Upzoning is the term. Upzoning. This is something in Newton's future, and it is what we're talking about today. I'm Jeff Stein, an architect, and joining me at the table are Robert Fizek and Marc Hershman, also architects here in Newton. You should know their names. Ha, 3 architects. 3. This should be good. We hope so. Robert, what do we mean really when we say upzoning? In fact, even before then,
Sure.
what does zoning mean here in Newton?
Yeah, well, zoning here in Newton, any place else zoning is merely a set of regulations that are meant to describe what can or should be built in any, municipal environment.
So how do we arrive at them? Do we get to vote on them? Does everyone agree on zoning issues in Newton?
Well, no, and our zoning, most of it was established several decades ago. And there have been changes and improvements along the way and updating, but currently there's quite a significant
Yes, there's a significant proposal for upzoning. What does that mean exactly, upzoning?
Well, my understanding of upzoning is that it's meant to provide developers and development with additional opportunities where they don't currently have it.
So it expands what can happen in any particular place. In fact, in the center of the villages, it actually means literally going up.
Quite a lot, yes, in many cases.
Is that a good thing? I guess it certainly is for some people.
Well, I think what Marc and I have been working on is trying to understand what is the thinking behind this, and we're finding that the thinking may not be all as correct that they say it is. It's really more of a formulaic approach to providing density and what are supposed to be affordable housing opportunities. There are a lot of promises, but so far we haven't seen anything that indicates that any of this performs as intended.
Yes, this is a really interesting issue about buildings. They both have form and performance. That's part of architecture, and some of the work that still needs to be done is about how this upzoning will really perform in the real world. Marc, you have some images of what upzoning might look like in Newton.
Yes, we looked at the proposals, and we weren't getting enough real visuals of what it would look like.
So these are proposals that are made by who? There's a planning, they're city planners in Newton, right?
Correct, and they have consultants. And as it's been discussed, it's not totally clear who the main motivating forces are, whether they're drawing from codes that were developed elsewhere or a hybrid. Nevertheless, they're applying quite a bit of upzoning to our community.
Plus, I'm a little mystified about what the market is for this sort of thing, just because Massachusetts itself has actually lost population over the last 2 censuses, and Newton itself used to be at 90,000 people. Now it's down to 80,000, and it's hard to tell. Well, there are a lot of cries around the country and in Massachusetts too about there being a housing crisis, but really it's an affordability crisis, and so it's an economic crisis more than a housing, we seem to have enough housing. It's just that half of us can't afford it.
Well, I think it's what's fascinating, and we'll be discussing in this show and in others, where can affordable housing appropriately go, and how do you do it? And what we feel is these proposals are not really addressing how to achieve affordability.
Well, affordability in Newton, that's a different context altogether. When the median home price is $900,000 per home, it's hard to imagine what affordable might mean here. So,
Right. Over a few mayors and studies, they've actually just set out and stated you can't build your way to affordability in a built community as Newton, and specifically Newton.
well, let's see what they have in mind.
Very good. So we have previously did a presentation on how to make a village center inviting. And inviting, what we discovered is 1, 2, and 3-story buildings is what makes our community and a built environment inviting.
Oh,
a
and
village.
it's a village center
A
because
village center.
Newton isn't just this one pancake of a city, but in fact, it's a suburb that is made up of 12 or 13 actual villages. So
Correct.
when you live here, you live in Newton Highlands or Newton Center or Waban, or you identify with those villages and their centers.
Right, and the lovely thing about a garden city like Newton is the desire to maintain a village feel. And so let's go through the visuals, and we're going to look at 2 key village centers, Newton Highlands and Newtonville. So they are proposing VC 1, 2, and 3.
So
One-
those initials VC, that means village center?
Yes.
Correct.
Oh.
So Village Center 1 is still in transition, pretty much residential now. Initially it was residential and commercial. It had a lot of people up in arms because they were addressing that in residential neighborhoods. So that's being toned down somewhat.
So in that village center one, that residential, those are the green things on this map, right?
Correct. But the desire and response to tone it down only happened through such advocacy as our own advocacy. So Village Center 2 is more in the built areas where there are retail and a bit commercial. So Village Center 2 is proposed to increase the heights to 3.5 story, plus a bonus, an additional, if they add what, quote unquote, a little more affordability, is as we discussed, that's a bit questionable.
Oh, a little more affordability, and you can pack some more people in then too, huh?
Correct, exactly.
Oh, boy. Huh.
So, and Village Center 3 is 4.5 stories, and again, the allowance through special permit for another story, again, for the reasons that are questionable. And we find that even the 3.5 story and the 4.5 story are too high. Village Center, as we discussed, is 1, 2, and at most 3 stories. In our discoveries and investigations throughout the country and even abroad, that's the scale, that's sort of the metric that gives us village. So let's take a
above
look.
3 stories, things start to become urban, don't they?
Exactly.
Kind of citified.
Exactly. The infrastructure, the elevators, the population, the traffic, all the additional benefits, or as one might say, not benefits of high density, it requires a different urban construct. So, shall we? Let's take a look. So this is their updated of their plans, and you can see the green is further intruding on residential areas for a little more high density to accommodate the state imposition of upzoning on a whole state level.
Oh,
And yes,
looking at this, there are these. There's a T there, right? So there's a transit station right there.
That's
correct.
the Highlands T station.
And so This is what used to be called a generation ago smart growth. Is that the idea that you pack a lot of people right next to a train station and that somehow is smart?
Well, yeah, and I think in many parts of the country where things aren't entirely built out, this may make some sense, where you have lots of gaping holes and incomplete
Right, but here in
neighborhoods.
Newton, we're already built out in those places.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I wouldn't risk my young career on riding the T from where I live, one town, to a town miles away where I might work. And in fact, I'm not alone in this. And since COVID, millions of households have stopped going to central business districts, and millions of jobs are done right from home. In fact, all three of us as architects, we have work. We're doing some interesting work, and we're doing it all from home too. Interesting. The other thing, of course, is that during COVID, the MBTA received over $2 billion worth of tax money from local, state, and federal tax services, you citizens, and still, at the end of this fiscal year, it's predicted to be in the red by some $400 million. This is an interesting situation to imagine that we're going to put more pressure on a transit system that was America's first, but 100 years later doesn't really work that well.
Correct. So specifically on the village centers, in regard to, we're looking at Lincoln Street, which is 1, 2, and 3 stories. And the 3 stories, what we feel from the metrics we've discovered, is reasonable and really should be the max in regard to the proportion of the street.
Well, that looks
and
like a
the feel.
delightful spot. Although, how many cars a day do you think go past here? 100,000? 80,000?
I have no idea. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot.
That may be a big number, but it's a lot.
And so, given that, why would you want to build taller buildings and have more people living right next to car and noise and carbon monoxide dense corridors?
I don't think one would.
Why is this such a good idea?
Well, the rationale is also to limit parking. And as we were discussing about transit, the number of households in America is over 80, probably close to 90% of American households have access to a car.
Right.
Now, why? Because it allows the freedom of not just to go to the central business district for a job, but to seek jobs elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a really important thing, and in Newton, it's especially important since the central business district that we're talking about is Boston, which now is 20% vacant in terms of office and commercial space. There are now over 900 million square feet of office and commercial space in America that are vacant. Over 100 million square feet of vacancy in Manhattan alone. Central Business District, that was a nice idea back when, but we seem to have gone away from that with the notion of computer networks.
And it also has to do with residences as well. Not only do we not need the density of a central business district, but do we have to pack residences so close together to be close to that central business district?
Right, not necessarily, huh? So what's proposed for this particular spot?
So there's another view of the street, Lincoln Street. The gray is a section that illustrates the cross-section of its height. And here we have the example of what a build-out would be on one side of the street. That's quite a transformation. But let's look at what would happen across the street. And I've been kind enough not to fill in the whole street. And this is dramatic, and the imposition is
and
quite stunning.
And let's also not forget to point out that this upzoning is by right, and which by definition means that it's not it's not the planning department's choice of what goes where. It's
Well, right,
the
once
builder's
the
choice.
planning department goes ahead and upzones, then it's like a free-for-all, and anybody can do whatever they want to build out to the zoning envelope,
Correct.
which is now twice the size that it used to be.
Right. And we have the city, the community has very little to say about it.
So where does all the water and electricity come from that's going to service this place that's now double the size? And where does all the sewage go to?
Well,
There are these infrastructure issues that seem to be important that planners aren't talking about. Instead, they're just talking about building form rather than building performance.
correct. And in fact, in reality, the planners are not doing much planning. Not in the planning that we understand is
It's true.
Careful.
Planning is a lot more difficult than what we're seeing so far.
I mean, if we just think in our community, when you just have a new residence going in, there's a lot of transformation in the residential districts. Just for a residence, you see not just the construction of the structure, but there's digging in the street, connecting to the systems, upgrading systems. So it's not a minor issue. And like we discussed, infrastructure and the effects on the services, schools, and that's just the beginning of it.
Show us another. These are proposals from the Newton Planning Department, and pretty soon the City Council is going to vote on whether or not to make these the law of the land. Is that right?
Correct. So
it's quite frightening.
Robert was saying that we don't have a say, and the public should have a say, and our representatives need to be listening to the public and take into account professionals like ourselves who are able to bring in to play the look and feel what these things will really be like if these things transpire. So we're showing here here we can see it full screen, Lincoln Street, and the height of the 3-story buildings, which we feel are acceptable, is about 38 feet. But here we'll see what the proposal is, and that is, what I'm showing here is VC2. This is zoned for VC3. Even VC2 with a 3-story and a 3.5-story height would be 44 and 62 feet high, significantly higher than what we see is appealing for Lincoln Street. The proposal is for 57 and 75 feet. Now that is quite stunning. Twice as high and twice as dense as what is currently there.
And this is for the most part residential too. That is to say, there aren't going to be offices. There might be still some commercial on the street, although, you know, when you add a story or 2 stories to an existing building, you know, you don't just build on top of the building that's already there. There has to be usually an entirely new structure to hold that extra weight, and different egress and stair and elevator requirements. You know, after COVID, the last place I want to be is an elevator with a lot of other people who may be COVID positive still, or working on the next pandemic. Gosh, and this doesn't even talk about what the carbon footprint of Newton might be. You know, as a garden city, there's something really wonderful to be said for what Newton does right now for the entire region in terms of forests and trees and green space generally. But interestingly, in America, a quarter of the carbon in the atmosphere comes from all the transportation, boats, cars, trains, planes, motorcycles. Another quarter comes from manufacturing, because we don't manufacture that much, but half of all the carbon in the atmosphere comes from buildings, from constructing them and from running them. So, gosh, folks, when your grandchild asks you 30 years from now what you did in the coming climate crisis in Newton, you can say, well, I helped double Newton's carbon footprint.
Right. No, so do we add density to the urban concrete construct, or do we have a better vision of distributing our humanity in with nature? Perhaps that's more in core with our humanity. So let's take a look at some of the results of what we would get if we built out to that extent. Here on the left side, we have the 4.5-story buildings. And now on the other side. Now people were surprised, wow, they're not going to be that big. It's not going to be that like that, will it? But
yes, it will. It'll have to be, or else developers aren't going to be able to make all the money that they need to make.
So we're now showing the section of the heights that they're proposing. And what it shows is the 57 and 75 feet numbers are even higher than the images we're showing here. So they would be even higher.
So it's going to get worse before it gets a lot worse.
Yes, and in regard to the economics, if we're a wise community, do we just accommodate builders that say, this is what we have to build to be profitable? Furthermore, it's questionable. They will always say that they need more than they really do to make a profit. And in history, if you set some constraints, they will still find a way to make a profit. And our suggestion is to keep our communities at 3 stories high, and they will be able to make a profit. So we have some other, Newtonville is another example. Similar, VC3 is suggested along Walnut Street. And Walnut Street is another cute street on the right-hand side, has a feel like Concord, Main Street in Concord. That character is New England. And even on the left-hand side, the one-story retail, you see retail malls, many times the outdoor malls, they're constructed 1 story, even recent ones on Needham Street, 1-story retail.
And that's because if you have more stories, you have to have more structure and columns coming down, and it takes up the retail space. It even takes up the window space that's being displayed to sidewalks.
Right. If you want successful retail, you focus it on retail. Okay, so you could have retail, you could have 2 stories. And if you do it creatively, you integrate the 2 stores, the 2 floors with stores. You want retail, you do retail, and that's what's vibrant in these sort of village centers. And these stores are occupied, and so you can't make them more vibrant. You don't have to tear them down to make them more vibrant.
Oh, and by the way, the small business community is very, very unsure of this whole proposal because they suffer first.
Well, right, they do suffer first, because once you feel that you can build higher, you have to tear down what's there. You're not just going to build on top of what's there on a restaurant or a sporting goods store and let that business stay in business while you build. That whole thing has to close down, be removed, and then over, I don't know, 18 months, 2 years' time, it gets built up, but whoever was running that business before is no longer there, and neither is the business.
Correct.
Wow.
So while you were speaking, I was showing some of the graphics of, again, the proposals of where they're heading. Walnut Street, 28 feet high. If it was VC2, that is possibly close to what we could tolerate, but still significantly higher. We don't need 3.5 stories. 3 stories is what we need. And what they're proposing, though, is the 4.5 stories, which, as you can see, is pretty much 3 times higher than what's currently there.
I want to underline that when Marc says proposing, these are written, charted criteria
It's not just people sitting around the table talking.
that are being pushed forward despite the local area council saying, no, time out. This isn't what we signed up for. We've heard from our community, there have been studies done in Newtonville, and there have been other outreach opportunities where the community said, no, 3 stories, maybe there are some places where 4 or 5 are okay, very few, but we would like to keep the characteristics of our villages and not overbuild.
Huh. Yeah, the character of our villages, the character of living in Newton, why we all moved there in the first place,
Exactly.
and why other people will want to move there too. Not because it's just like Brighton or downtown Boston, but because
Precisely.
it's Newton.
It has character, and the bigger buildings rarely can elicit the character.
Yeah.
It's scale. So that you mentioned the village councils responding to this, not affirmatively in dismay, that's where the communities are speaking up, and the overall council needs to pay attention.
And that's really been
needs to hear
the
that.
only place where there's been an interchange of ideas.
Yeah, well, communities, speak up. This is an issue not just for residents, but for citizens. So your voice can be heard, and you need to talk to your town council person and let your voice be heard. And that's it for us tonight. How's this?